My wife and I were a young and successful couple. Life was moving full speed ahead, and I was proud that at such an early stage, we had our own restaurant, which provided a steady income. My restaurant was my pride and joy. I had invested a lot of time and effort into it. It was in a good location, had a loyal customer base, and business was thriving. My wife worked with me, managing the front of house as an administrator, which brought us even closer together. We didn't have children, not because we couldn't afford it, but because we didn't feel ready for that step yet. Our main focus at the time was our careers and building a future. That was our passion. We were ambitious, young, and full of energy. However, the stability and predictability of our lives started to unravel unexpectedly. My business, which seemed untouchable, began to falter. One day, a new, modern restaurant opened not far from mine, and it immediately started drawing attention. Its opening was a blow for me. I didn't even know who owned the place, but one thing was clear. The competition was serious. The new restaurant was in a prime location, a much busier area with more foot traffic. In some ways, it felt like I had already lost before the battle had even started. Location was crucial in the restaurant business, and theirs was far superior. On top of that, their prices were lower than mine. I couldn't afford to set such low prices because my business was centered on high-quality service and premium ingredients, which naturally increased the cost of our dishes. I had always taken pride in the fact that the food in my restaurant was made from the best products, and our service was top-notch. But the new competition started luring my customers away with their lower prices and prime location. Gradually, the flow of customers into my restaurant began to shrink. At first, the changes were small. One or two regulars started visiting less frequently. Then, that number grew. Soon, I noticed that our dining room had become eerily quiet. At that moment, I felt a sense of helplessness, as if I was being pushed out of the place that once seemed so secure. My wife and I didn't know what to do. I felt young and inexperienced, especially in such a critical situation. It seemed like all my efforts were in vain. I tried everything to turn things around. We started running promotions, offering discounts, and even added new dishes to the menu. But it felt like trying to plug a hole in a dam. The gap kept widening, and nothing I did could stop the steady stream of customers flowing to the new restaurant. At some point, I realized that my actions were more like panic moves than a solid strategy. But what else could I do? I had no experience in crisis management, and advice from others didn't seem to apply to our situation. My wife was just as lost. She tried to stay positive, but I could see how much the situation was weighing on her. We spent long hours discussing how to save our business, but we couldn't find a solution. Every idea we came up with either seemed insufficient or didn't bring the desired results. It increasingly felt like the foundation of our business, which we had once considered rock solid, was starting to crumble. Of course, we could have thought about lowering our prices, but that would have meant lowering our quality, and I was strongly opposed to that. My restaurant had always been known for its high quality, and I didn't want to compromise that. But the market was dictating its own terms, and I was gradually coming to terms with the fact that I might need to make more radical decisions if I didn't want to lose the business altogether. Those months were difficult. Sometimes, in the evenings, when the restaurant was almost empty, I would sit alone in the dining room, staring at the half-empty tables, wondering how everything had gone wrong. I felt like I was losing a game where I didn't even know the rules. It seemed like everything I had worked for was falling apart, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The hardest part was admitting to myself that I couldn't handle the situation. I wasn't prepared for such a sharp turn of events. To make things worse, our relationship began to strain. The work on the restaurant, which had once united us, now became a source of stress and conflict. We both tried to keep our cool, but constant disagreements about what to do next only heightened the tension. We started arguing over trivial things. I began to feel guilty for not being able to foresee the changes and for my inability to manage the situation, which had brought us to this crisis. When we first started this business, it had seemed so promising. We dreamed of great success, of one day making our restaurant a place people from all over the city would come to. But now, all those dreams seemed distant and unreachable. Instead of growing our business, I was fighting for its survival. I often found myself asking, how had things changed so drastically? Why hadn't I seen the danger earlier? Maybe I should have been more cautious and prepared for the day when competition would become fiercer. But back then, I couldn't have predicted any of this. My wife and I built our business on enthusiasm, a love for what we did, and a belief in our own abilities. We believed everything would go according to plan. Every time I walked into the restaurant and saw the empty tables, I remembered the days when it was full of life. Those days when people laughed, enjoyed their food, and I would walk around the dining room, feeling proud of what we had created. Now, all of that seemed distant and unattainable. At this point, I can't say that I found a way out of this situation. The business continued to lose ground, and I increasingly felt like time was running out. After I started suspecting that there might be more than just a professional relationship between Susie and the school principal, I tried to remain calm and not jump to conclusions. But then something happened that made me seriously consider that my worries might be justified. One day, I came home from work earlier than usual. It had been a tough day, but I managed to finish my tasks faster, and I thought a bit of time at home would do me good. However, as I approached the house, I saw something strange. A Jeep parked in our driveway. It looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place where I had seen it before. At first, I thought it might belong to a friend of Susie's or maybe a neighbor, but something inside me stirred, giving me a sense of unease. As I approached the front door and opened it, I heard quiet voices. When I stepped into the kitchen, I saw Susie and the school principal sitting at the table, going over some papers. Both of them were wearing glasses, intently looking at the documents, exchanging quiet words. At first glance, nothing seemed suspicious, but at the same time, the situation felt too strange for an ordinary work meeting. This wasn't a school office. This was our home, the place where we built our life together. And I didn't remember a time when Susie had ever invited him over to discuss school matters here. When they noticed me, the principal quickly stood up, greeted me politely, and began nervously gathering his papers into his folder. He apologized for the inconvenience, saying they had just been discussing graduation-related matters. I stood there, watching him without saying a word. He seemed anxious. His movements were rushed, and he hurried to put on his coat and leave our house, as if his presence there was somehow wrong. After he left, the tension in the room was palpable. Susie, noticing my silence, immediately started explaining that they had just been working on paperwork and that this was the only time they could meet. She seemed flustered, which only deepened my suspicions. Why was she so nervous? I wanted to believe her, but inside, I felt a growing sense of unease. We sat down for dinner later that evening, but despite my efforts to act normal, my thoughts were racing. Questions began to form in my mind. Why had our home suddenly become a place for discussing school matters? Why did the principal seem so uncomfortable when I arrived? It all seemed too implausible. My trust in Susie began to crack, and though I tried not to panic, I couldn't deny that something inside me was already starting to crumble. The next day, after a sleepless night, I decided it was time to get to the bottom of this. I couldn't stand being left in the dark any longer. After work, I drove to the school. This time, I was determined to talk to the principal directly. I knew I needed to clarify the situation to understand if my suspicions were justified, or if I was just overthinking everything. When I walked into his office, the principal was alone. He looked up at me, a bit surprised by my visit, but quickly regained his usual confident composure. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I sat down across from him and began speaking immediately. I explained that, despite respecting his and my wife's professional relationship, I was concerned about how often they had been meeting, especially outside of school. I told him frankly that I didn't understand why they had been discussing school matters in our home, and that their relationship was starting to make me uneasy. He listened to me carefully and, to my surprise, didn't become defensive or try to justify himself. His response was calm and measured, but I detected a hint of discomfort in his tone. He said that they had been forced to meet at our house out of sheer necessity. On that particular day, there hadn't been time to find another place to discuss organizational matters. He assured me that it wouldn't happen again and that his relationship with Susie remained strictly professional. I wanted to believe him, but something in his voice sounded unconvincing. He was saying all the right things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. We shook hands, and I left his office, but I wasn't any closer to having real answers. Instead, my anxiety only grew. After that conversation, I began seeing everything in a different light. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on between them. Every little thing seemed suspicious now. Even the way Susie talked about work, the looks she gave, the way she acted when she came home. I started wondering, had something started long before I noticed their frequent meetings? After all my attempts to save the business and trying to keep us afloat financially, while watching my wife drift further away, I realized something had to change. I came to the conclusion that family mattered more than anything. Without her, success in business was meaningless. No matter how hard I tried to revive the restaurant, if I lost her, I would lose everything. The decision came suddenly. I needed to do something special, something to remind us of the moments that once brought us together, to show that even in difficult times, we could still find our way back to each other. One evening, I decided to pick her up from work and surprise her with a romantic dinner in our empty restaurant. The place had been closed for some time, the hall standing cold and silent, but that evening I wanted to breathe life into it, if only for a few hours. I set up a table for us in the center of the room, prepared a meal, my signature dish, which had always been her favorite, and played soft music to fill the empty space, creating a warm and magical atmosphere. When I arrived to pick her up from her restaurant, she seemed confused. "Why are we coming here? We usually just go home after work," she asked. I only smiled and said, "Just follow me. I have a surprise for you." She seemed puzzled but followed me. As we walked into our restaurant, I gestured toward the table. "This is for us," I said. "I think we need this right now, to take a break from everything." She stood there, stunned at first, then smiled, though her smile seemed forced, almost fake. Still, we sat down, and as the wine flowed, the mood lightened. Slowly, she started to relax, and by the end of dinner, she seemed genuinely at ease. We talked about everything. Us, our life, the reasons we had grown distant. For once, there were no arguments, no raised voices. We calmly discussed the things that had been building up between us. We apologized to each other for the misunderstandings that had driven us apart. Of course, the wine helped. We both knew that. Under its influence, words flowed more freely. But even so, it was a rare moment of honesty between us. Later, I played her favorite song and invited her to dance. We danced slowly in the center of the room, and in those moments, I could feel the spark between us reigniting. As I looked into her eyes, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, something that had once held us together. Our movements grew closer, our bodies closer, and before we knew it, we were kissing passionately, right there in the empty restaurant, surrounded by the music and the lingering aroma of dinner. It ended with us making love on the table I had so carefully set for dinner. When we finally made it home late that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. That night, I felt close to her again, like we used to be when our life seemed simple and full of joy. But the next morning, all of it was gone. When we woke up, neither of us said a word. We didn't even say good morning to each other. We just went our separate ways, her to work and me to my restaurant. All day, I couldn't stop thinking about the night before, about my surprise. How could it not have been enough for her to feel something real for me again? Why did the spark that had felt so real the night before disappear with the sunrise? I was confused, and that's when I started to realize that the problem might be much deeper than I had thought. You understand what I mean, don't you? That same day, I decided to take another step. I made up an excuse to visit her at work. Deep down, I felt like something was wrong, but I still hoped that it was just in my head. I bought a bouquet of flowers, a gesture I thought would show her I was still fighting for us. When I arrived, I noticed she wasn't at her usual station. The guy behind the bar, who seemed to be the bartender, told me she was in a meeting with the director. Everything started to fall into place. My heart began to race, and a chill ran down my spine. I went to look for the director's office, where they were supposed to be. Without knocking, I pushed the door open, and what I saw left me frozen in place. The scene I walked into burned itself into my mind forever. My wife, with the man who had destroyed my business, was making love to him on his desk. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was too much to process. I heard her voice, trying to offer explanations, excuses, but they sounded distant, like noise in the background. I dropped the bouquet on the floor, turned around, and left the restaurant without a word. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if I was sinking into a void where there were no feelings, no thoughts, just one overwhelming sensation: betrayal. After that incident in the competitor's office, when I caught my wife with another man, our marriage fell apart. She no longer lived in my house, which, by the way, belonged to me, but went to that same restaurant owner. As soon as it happened, I still couldn't believe that the woman I had lived with for years could so easily give up everything and go to another man, just because he was more successful than me. It was humiliating, insulting, and, to be honest, devastated me. But do you know how I responded to that? If you were in my place, what would you do? Some would remain silent, others would talk to their friends, but I decided to do something different. I posted about the situation on Facebook, directly from my restaurant's page. In this post, I tagged both the competitor's restaurant page and my ex-wife's page. Yes, I knew it would be dirty, that I could be criticized, but at that moment I didn't care. Emotions running high and a burning sense of betrayal demanded an outlet. As soon as the post was published, my phone literally exploded with reactions. Likes, comments, reposts. All of this washed over me in a wave. People are always drawn to scandals, especially such public ones. They greedily absorb any drama, discuss, condemn, and create their own versions of what is happening. Within a few hours, my story spread throughout the city. People supported me, said that I did the right thing, although, probably, there were those who condemned. But at that moment, I no longer saw the difference. The main thing was that the truth came out. My wife betrayed me with someone who destroyed my business, and now the whole city knew about it. I was no longer a victim in their eyes. Now I was the one who managed to avenge his humiliation. I would not be surprised if you think that this was an unnecessary step, that it was worth acting differently. But you know, when you're betrayed, especially by someone you've shared your life with, sometimes you want to strike back, even if you know it may not be satisfying in the long run. The consequences of my actions were greater than I expected. In an instant, I destroyed not only my wife's reputation, but also the reputation of my competitor. Word of mouth works great, especially in small towns where people tend to talk about each other. Within days, the whole town was talking about how my wife had left me for a more successful man, and now this man was associated not only with personal betrayal, but also with business unethicality. People stopped going to the competitor's restaurant, and his business began to rapidly collapse. Soon the place closed, so quickly that I barely had time to process what had happened. The irony is that I didn't even want to destroy his business in the first place. But they deserved it, both of them. What happened could not remain without consequences. The moment the competitor's restaurant closed, my business began to recover. The flow of customers returned, all thanks to that one post I had made in a moment of anger. People who had previously flowed to a more successful establishment were now returning to me. My restaurant was alive again, and I felt like I had regained control of my destiny. It's amazing how one action, born of emotion, can change the course of events. But if I told you it brought me true satisfaction, I'd be lying. Deep down, I knew that I had not only ruined their lives and reputations, but a peace of mind as well. Revenge rarely brings the relief that you seek. Instead, it leaves a void. Do you understand what I'm saying? That fleeting triumph when your enemy falls is replaced by something far more depressing. My business was booming again. People began to talk about how I had endured all the trials and tribulations, how I had managed to rise up after all that. In their eyes, I became something of a local legend. A man who had lost everything, and then gained it back, and then some. But all this hype around success couldn't drown out one important fact. Inside, I still felt empty. Yes, my career was on the rise again, but the emotional wounds were still open. Of course, over time, the pain subsided, and I began to see my decision in a different light. Yes, I had taken revenge. Yes, it had brought visible results. But at the same time, I began to ask myself, was it worth it? Was revenge really the only thing I could do? Maybe there was another way? Of course, time cannot be turned back, and events have already unfolded the way they did. But what would you have done in my place? The word revenge is easy to say, but the consequences of such a choice can last much longer than you would like.